The Urbanist is brought to you in association with the Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is a beacon of hope and inspiration. A catalyst to spark growth and collaboration with museums and experiences, where art and science and nature and technology coexist.
The belief of Abu Dhabi that culture is the backbone of our society.
Stay tuned for a special episode of the show, in which you can hear His Excellency Mohammed Khalifa Al Mubarak explain exactly why and how Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is the perfect place to collaborate, create and innovate. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Carlotta Rebello. Coming up.
The traditional way of living in Muscat's been a lot about lower densities. That's been driven through a lot of things, really, access to land and how people have been living their lives. But the city is changing, and that's the primary driver of the planning work we've been doing.
We head to the Omani capital to see how a new plan for the city's future is helping to prepare for the population boom that is right around the corner for this fast-growing urban centre by the sea. Then,
in all of our work, we try to work in the great, complex, democratic, rich, messy environments that are our cities today.
We explore how design and architecture have been parts of the problem when it came to making cities which foster nature, culture and joy in the past, and how those same tools can be agents for change in the future. That's all coming up over the next 30 minutes right here on The Urbanist with me, Carlotta Rebello. Nestled into the Gulf of Oman, Muscat, the Omani capital, is a fast-growing city whose greater urban population is set to double by 2040. It has its own character, separate from its Arab counterparts, but it also shares some of the big questions facing its neighbours, namely how to fight climate change and counter car usage and urban sprawl. Global urbanism experts Broadway Malian were tasked with creating a plan for the future of the city region and have been working with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Planning to transform the area into a more green and resilient centre with a comprehensive and modern transport network. Recently, The Urbanist host, Andrew Tuck, was joined by Ed Baker, a practice principal and global urbanism leader at Broadway Malian. Ed began by setting the scene in Oman, describing its urban pressures and what his firm's plan is trying to achieve in the years to come.
I think the key thing is Oman's quite a different place to its neighbours like Dubai. It's got these wonderful natural assets, its coastline, and it's got a lot of heritage as well. And in those sense, it's very, very different. And I think the ambitions for Oman, it's been very dependent on oil. And so, like a lot of the countries in that region, it's about changing its economics. It's about diversifying. It's about how to protect the assets it's got. And it's how to build on things like tourism and how it moves into the future. At the same time, it wants to be more livable and resilient and improve the quality of life for its citizens as well. And so in Oman, they have the 2040 vision, which is really driving all the new planning in the country. And so that is the work that we've been doing falls under the 2040 vision. And their aspirations are to create better spatial planning that can guide growth in the future, deliver their ambitions. And the work we're doing is obviously at the more city level and these smaller scale projects where you can start to see the wider aspirations of the plan realised on the ground and spatially.
The capital is Muscat, and the area that's lived in, a lot of it's sandwiched between mountains and the sea. And I guess one of the things that Muscat has been known for, lauded for, the fact that it's a pretty low-rise city in comparison to some of its neighbours on the Gulf. But I guess this causes some problems because there's quite a lot of sprawl. The city has spread rather than risen in many ways.
Yeah, and I think this is probably one of the main driving factors of the plan actually is around containing this sprawl. It's a city that's still very dependent on car transport and this sort of disconnection between where people are living and the economic centres. And so really, if you're going to pick out one primary driver for the plan, it's been about trying to contain the sprawl, put some limits on the growth. It's going to double in population, but with that growth, how do you start to look at more compact development? How can you start to create, with that, a more sort of connected public transport system and other things that will start to contain that sprawl? Because as you mentioned, the traditional way of living in Muscat's been a lot about lower densities. That's been driven through a lot of things, really, access to land and how people have been living their lives. But, the city is changing. And with that, that's the primary driver of the planning work we've been doing.
And Ed, tell me, so you're coming up with, in essence, a master plan for how that development should happen and also where the development should not happen. Are you then connecting them with the people that need to come in to build that public transport? Or are you working alongside partners already in place?
Yeah, so the plan, really sets the vision. Before you start bringing investment in, you need a framework. So we've prepared a spatial plan, and that sort of drives things like the movement structure, the open space network. It controls things like the density and the economic centres. But actually, the other thing that we've prepared is an implementation plan. And that's really key. And that's the document that helps to identify how you bring the investment in, where the money should be focused. So, for example, one of the key drivers of the plan is this public transport and a light rail corridor. And so that will need investment, but also that will also open up investment and opportunities along it as we start to look at things like transit-orientated development and density. So really the plan is an opportunity to frame the investment and bring the right people in.
I saw a nice promotional video that you'd made for some of the storytelling around the ambitions. And obviously you see there the idea of moving people out of their cars into public transport, which is always a challenge in any city, but certainly in a hot city and certainly in a place where the car is so central to people's lives. But also this picking up on a topic that's global, I guess, in the 15-minute city, so how you make buildings have resources on their doorsteps. Because again, when we look in the region, often great buildings have gone up in the sense that they're iconic, but often the public realm has been missing, or the facilities that then make life enjoyable in those places. Just tell us a little bit about that, the cultural shift that you're trying to embed in this plan as well.
I mean, this plan has come about through a long period of consultation with different stakeholders and parties. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, one of the strong themes is around sort of connectivity and investing in the public transport network. And that's from the big moves, when you're looking at the light rail, the bus rapid transit, but also down to those sort of more smaller scale moves as you start to look at the cycle networks, the open park network. There's a very rich network of wadis in the city, and how we start to connect those, how we connect people down to the coast as well. And it's that sort of more neighbourhood level when you start to see the pedestrian connections. And so that's the transit orientated development, but also at that scale, it's about density, it's about planning around the public transport and bringing people closer, bringing people from their homes closer to where they want to live and work as well, and the entertainment, and bringing the cultural aspects together as well, so they're all more compact and walkable and accessible.
Obviously, you're working with Omani partners. They're your leads on this, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Planning, to create this structure plan. When you speak to them, what is the big vision bit? You've talked about 2040, but what do they hope for Oman, for Muscat, as the city develops?
I think one of the key drivers, and I've mentioned mobility, is a really big one. That's a real step change. People are driving. It's a city that sprawls. I think they really want to start to revisit and promote more compact development, and that's a big one. But I think if you look at the 2040 vision, I talked about this shift in economics, moving away from oil and the construction industries and looking at new industries. I think these are new economics. And for us, when we start to look at the plan, is how can we start to identify new centres for industry? So whether that's creating a new business centre for finance, or is that looking at new industries like renewables or biotech? And so I think the economics have been a really key aspiration. It's this step change away from where Oman is at the moment. It's also then looking at the aspects like the tourism. It's a city that's very rich in terms of heritage and tourism, and how can more be made of that, and how can they attract more visitors, but obviously do tourism in the right way as well. So I think the economics is a big driver, and that's probably the most obvious step from a 2040 plan at the very broad level of a country, and then how that is then realised at the city level and the type of planning that we're doing.
Finally, just tell me, as it begins to be implemented, how long before you think that visitors to Muscat, to Oman, will begin to see a change, begin to see this more connected city, but also greater protection put in place for the incredible natural resources that the country has?
The most important thing for us is, you've got a very big plan, but you start to break that down. And so a lot of the work we then start to do is identify catalyst projects. As you start to zoom in and you can see things that could happen sooner rather than later. And that relates to the implementation plan. And it's those projects that could happen, tomorrow, over the next year and 2 years. And they're the things that you'll start to see change and make an immediate impact. The big items like the light rails will take longer to come and have an impact, but you can start to see, improvements to the waterfront, the public realm, an investment in culture. And I think those changes you'll start to see, very soon, if they're not happening already anyway in the city. So you can have a big plan, but, those early phases and those catalyst projects are really important. And they need to start to demonstrate, the aspirations of the plan. So if the plan is about, creating a green Muscat, those smaller public realm interventions are starting to take one of the wadis and turning it into more of a recreational corridor. That's when you start to see the change sooner rather than later.
Ed Baker there, practice principal and global urbanism leader for Broadway Melian, speaking with Andrew Tuck. Taking a cross-discipline approach to the existential problems facing our cities, and by extension our entire urbanizing world, is essential if we hope to tackle what is to come. Beyond the planning stage, as we just heard about in Oman, the design world too has its part to play. But what exactly are the big challenges the design industry could currently be helping us to tackle?
Climate change, political division, and a growing mental health crisis that I think all can be tracked back to the design of our communities.
That's Vishan Chakrabarti. He recently released a book titled The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing for Nature, Culture and Joy. The title unpacks the history of urban development and how the design of our cities connects humans as a social species. It also explains how design can do more to tackle our ongoing challenges. I recently spoke to Vishan about his book and began by asking why now was the time to write about design, given the issues our cities currently face are so great.
I think it's the perfect time. Look, for the industry, we've been going down a very stupid path for a long time known as starchitecture. When worldwide leaders, community groups think of architects, they think of people building spaceships in the sand built by slaves, instead of understanding how it is architects help to build and rebuild community. So if you're a politician, an economist, a journalist, and you're concerned with the big issues of our day, of climate change, of increasing political division, a widening mental health, public health, drug crisis, why would you think that an architect would be a relevant person to talk to if that person thinks that their definition of success is building crazy stuff out in the Saudi Arabian desert with slaves? We have to rethink this. We have to rethink in the industry our definition of success. So I wrote this book at this moment to make this argument that in this post-pandemic situation, where suddenly the whole question of urbanity is, what we in the United States call the jump ball. It's kind of basketball metaphor that says, we don't know where the ball's going to land. There's still a lot to sort out about how people will work, how urban density will work. My point is that not just cities, not just big cities, but villages, any places where we create collective communities across scales, refugee camps, academic campuses, that we are seeking to live together. And the design of those environments influence, obviously, climate in terms of density, mass transit use, the materials we use to build, address political division in terms of creating physical spaces that people of difference can come together and see each other eyeball to eyeball. So if I see a person wearing a burqa in a public park, that person is much less frightening to me than they are in social media. So I think we live in a world where social media has been pulling us apart. And to me, the antidote is how great design can bring us together. And so we have to stop worrying about building crazy multi-billion dollar projects that half the time there's no program or use for, and instead really focus on rebuilding our world, especially post-industrial America, post-industrial UK. You look at the political divisions that are happening between an urban and rural divide in almost every major country in the world. These are enormous places where architects and urbanists can make a difference. And part of what the book is trying to do is say that not just architects and urbanists and students and so forth, but also to policymakers, to decision makers, to say, you have to think about our built environment if you're going to solve these big problems. It is not just about economics and policy.
Well, one of the things about architecture is that it's fundamentally a collaborative practice, really. This idea that you were describing of, the phenomenon of the star architect kind of almost isolates a practice that by its own nature should be about collaboration, about reaching out to fully understand the communities that the sector is impacting. I'm curious then, you outline in the book's title these sort of three guiding pillars that cities need: nature, culture, and joy. And you've alluded to this a bit already, but what made you choose these three aspects in particular?
It's interesting because in the United States with this election, there's all of this talk of joy all of a sudden with our fabulous new presidential candidate. And obviously the title of the book was established well before that happened, but I'm glad that it had that kind of zeitgeist moment. I think we need to talk about nature, culture, and joy. Climate change for a lot of people is far too abstract a term. Nature is something that I think everyday people seek in their lives, whether they live out in the natural world in rural areas or whether they live in dense cities and need like a small pocket of nature. Culture, to me, is now the driving force of communal civilization, because if you take out this idea that you don't necessarily all need to be in an office building every day, 5 days a week, 6 days a week, the reason we're together is for culture, to share culture, to grow culture. And that inevitably leads to this idea of joy. And we've used technology to divide us. To me, it's very clear, and I'm a practicing architect. We have 30 people. We build a lot of the kinds of projects that I think help to exemplify what I'm talking about. The Domino Sugar Refinery on the Brooklyn waterfront, our Interoculus Canopy project in Columbus, Indiana. They're all places that provide platforms for people of difference to come together and interact eye to eye. So for instance, think about the Israel-Gaza crisis and all of the politics around that. At Domino, we've designed both interior and exterior spaces where I see people of all of those walks of life: Orthodox Jewish people, people of the Islamic faith, people who clearly would have different views about these very, very difficult topics, but their children play on the playground together. Those children, I think, will have a very different understanding of how to tackle issues like this because of that experience of the city and well-designed space bringing them together. And I think the book is dense because the first half of the book is quite depressing. The first half of the book is really trying to talk about how architecture and urbanism since World War II was used to segregate, and actually did the opposite of the things that I'm talking about. It was oriented around automobiles. It actually fueled climate change. It segregated people by race and class. And so you have to go through that history, because the same policymakers that I'm talking about would understandably be skeptical about saying, maybe we need to look to architects, urbanists, landscape architects to help us find solutions to these big problems, because we've been part of the problem. And so this is a moment to have a sea change in that conversation. So the reason the book literally is organized into despair and then hope is to say, yeah, it is an acknowledgement. We were part of the problem. We helped segregate the world. We helped create an auto-oriented world. We created places that pulled people apart. But the good news is that means we have the skill set to do the opposite. We just need to have the intentionality and the policy partners, as you mentioned, the collaborators. I do two highly creative things with my life. I write and I design. The designing part, sure, there's sometimes sketching alone and all of that. But as you say, most of architecture is a highly collaborative act with consultants, with clients, with government entities, with communities. Writing is a lovely, peaceful endeavor. You can kind of do it 4 in the morning. it's really important that we understand that design has that collaborative nature, because that is how we are going to get to better communities. And one of the points of the book is we still have a lot of population growth in the future. There's billions of people who are either unhoused or underhoused, dramatically underhoused. So we need to build things. And we have a lot of difficult issues to confront in building poor people. And so it's very, very important that we work collaboratively and kind of reverse the patterns of the past. And so hopefully the book will help people both understand that history and have some optimism about the future.
I'm curious, when you were writing this, who did you envision being the target audience? Was this seen as a wake-up call for your peers so that, precisely these things we've been talking about, collaboration and driving change from within and being able to put good design at the forefront instead of ego in many cases? Or was it more of raising this awareness of the power that good design can have in making cities better places to live and to call home?
It has the audacity of trying to do both. And this is why I think the book is very rich visually. We bring in lots of examples that we had to do drawings of historical places, everything again from very, very famous places in places like Paris and Tokyo and Sao Paulo, down to refugee camps and academic campuses, a wide range of places across all continents, but also a lot of imagery of the work of peers working across the world and cities around the world. Paris, Vienna, many of the newer Pritzker winners. Alejandro Aravena is a friend of mine, and who, in addition to doing his design, was helping to rewrite the constitution of Chile in the aftermath of the Santiago transit riots. And so, to answer your question, we do all of that to both speak to the profession internally in terms of reform, and externally to, again, policymakers, community members, just the interested public. So to me, the book sits kind of in the center of this beautiful hourglass, where at one level, it's speaking to an external audience, people who maybe don't know that much about architecture and might be curious about what does our built environment and the design of it. And by this, I don't just mean urban planning. I mean down to when we're designing something in our office, we think about, where does a door go? Where does a loading dock go? How do these things welcome people or shun people, in terms of trying to bring people together? So it's trying to speak to that external audience. But at the same time, I'm especially focused on speaking to students, giving them thoughts about what are new definitions for excellence in the field. Like, if it's not starchitecture, what is it? I argue that it should be thought leadership, that we should not just be practitioners, but thought leaders. It is trying to speak to the design media. It's trying to speak to, yes, a lot of my counterparts. And one thing I will say, I'm 58 years old, and I speak to other architects in our field who are prominent, and this also resonates with them. I mean, Jeannie Gang gave a quote in the back of the book. She's a dear friend, wonderful person, about the same age I am, and is also very, very focused on how can the definition of success of architecture be different? And again, Jeannie works with a lot of external people outside of architecture, just as I try to do. And so it is really a both-and condition of sitting in the middle of that hourglass for external and internal audiences. So hopefully it has some broad appeal.
Picking up on one of the other points that you made throughout the book, you talk as well about, this idea of fictional cities or utopias, and you play with, the Garden of Eden and why not the Garden of Urban. Now, our world is not shy to building cities from scratch, from purpose-built capitals to endeavors in the desert, as we were alluding to at the beginning. Considering we have had opportunities to build cities from scratch, why hasn't anyone been able to deliver an urban utopia yet?
Because to me, cities built from scratch are an oxymoron. One of the most important aspects of city building is the nature of time. We had a very famous senator here in New York, Moynihan, who said that if you want a great city, build a great university and wait 200 years. Cities are acts of accretion, and the cities that are most beloved by people have layers and layers of history, this is why I use in the book this word palimpsest. So if you look again at our Domino project, or I was very involved in the High Line, there's a way those projects pull history forward. They both speak to the history of the city and a future that we look to. So if the 20th century was about tabula rasa, about erasing and starting everything from scratch, I think the 21st century is all about the palimpsest of layering history, layering narrative, layering materiality. Most people are very suspect of brand new architecture in their community because, frankly, a lot of it's awful and most of it looks like it could be anywhere. A project like Domino can only be where it is. It is rooted in time and place. So the reason I talk about some of the utopian films like Black Panther and Wakanda isn't because I'm arguing we should build a city like that from scratch, although that would be fascinating. But there are lessons to be learned from the artistic license of a film like that, where Hannah Beachler, who is the art director, she designed a city basically. If you look carefully at those movies, there is urban density, towers, townhouses, and then there's farmland right next to it. There's no suburban anything in between. And so this is a message, right? And you have to look carefully to understand the power of that message. You'll notice that like most people walk around the city in that movie. And so I'm not saying that is therefore a utopian circumstance we should go out in a desert and build. I'm saying that it is a harbinger of things to come, of ideas that we could emulate in our existing cities. So I'm just a big believer in all of our work. We try to work in the great, complex, democratic, rich, messy environments that are our cities today, New York or Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, or London, or these places that, again, are just layers and layers of history. And I think the privilege of designing something in a great city like that is to understand that it's our job to be kind of stewards of that future-looking history, of that palimpsest, and using all of our tools as architects, the form of space, materials, things that channel that history, channel that sense of accretion, and give you something that both looks towards the future, but makes people feel more grounded in their communities, their history, their narrative. And I think we can do both. That was a false choice in the 20th century. In the 21st century, we can do it differently and better.
Vishaan Chakrabarti there, my thanks to him. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember, you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. You can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced by myself and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. Andrew Tuck will be back next week. I'm Carlotta Rebello. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.